In this lesson, we'll take a look at the main cell of the nervous system, which is the neuron. We'll focus on the anatomy of the neuron. So we could think of the neuron as the basic functional unit of the nervous system. This one has the ability to generate nerve impulses known as action potentials and then send them away. But they can also receive signals from other neurons. So therefore, the neuron functions in communication. It also functions in information processing and even control. We're going to break the neuron down into four distinct parts. We'll take a look at the cell body, also known as the soma, right? Soma is a really important word. Anytime you hear the word soma, think body, okay? Think body. The second part is going to be the dendrites. The third part is the axon, and then the very end of the axon, where the axon will branch out, we're going to refer to that as the telodendria. So here's a good color-guided diagram of the neuron. In blue, this is going to be the cell body or the soma. The yellow branching here are the dendrites. The reddish part right here, this is the axon. And the very end of the axon, right, if you notice, it doesn't end as a blunt end. It branches out. These are the telodendria. So let's take a look at the cell body first. Again, as I said before, this is known as the soma. It pretty much has the normal things that we would expect to see in a cell. It has a large nucleus as well as a nucleolus. The cytoplasm is referred to as the perikaryon. And then like I said, we have the typical organelles that we would typically see in a regular cell. We have mitochondria, right, which produce energy. We know they're the powerhouse of the cell. The Golgi apparatus, lysosomes. But here's a new term. We haven't used this before. When the ribosomes are actively producing proteins, they clump up, right? They form clusters, and they're attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And we could actually see that, and we call these clusters of the ribosomes in the cytoplasm, we call them Nissl bodies, right? So these are dense areas of the rough endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes in the perikaryon or the cytoplasm. It's interesting, when we have a lot of these, it actually makes the cell appear gray, and that's what produces gray matter. We also know from previous lessons that the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the ribosomes are going to be involved with protein production. So if you take a look here for a moment, right there. So we can see the nucleus, right? The dot in the middle is the nucleolus. Now we have mitochondria here, Golgi apparatus, but look here, the little dots are the ribosomes. See how they form clumps and they're on the rough ER? Here's another one here, right? This one's labeled up here. Here's another one. Okay, those are the Nissl bodies. Again, just the ribosomes and the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, got everything on that slide. So the neuron also has a cytoskeleton, just like our regular cells. So we have a combination of fibers. We have neurofilaments. These are similar to intermediate filaments in the regular cell. And we have neurotubules, which are similar to the microtubules in a regular cell. When we have bundles of neurofilaments, we called them neurofibrils, right? And they help to support the neuron, especially the dendrites, which are sticking out, and the axon. So they're functioning just like a regular cytoskeleton in a typical cell. Going back to this picture here for a moment, you can see some of these fibers here. Okay, these fibers in here, those are going to be the cytoskeleton. Okay. The second portion of the neuron that we want to take a look at are the dendrites. So these are short, highly branched processes that extend from the cell body. And think of the dendrites as the receiving portion of a neuron. This is where information is going to come into the neuron. All of the fine branching off of the dendrites are known as dendritic spines. Look at this. They make that up to 80 to 90% of the neuron surface area. Let's take a look. Right, so these again would be the dendrites, and then you can see they just branch and just they branch out more and more and more. Right, all of this would be the dendrites. And again, this is where information comes into the neuron. Information is going to come in. Okay, that's the dendrites. Right, so we have the cell body or the soma down. We have the dendrites. The next portion of the neuron is the axon, right? This is usually the longest portion of the neuron, but they can be pretty small. They can be micrometers in the brain, right, which is really, really small, or they can be a couple feet in length, right? If you think of a nerve like the sciatic nerve that comes down out from our low back and then goes all the way down the lower limb, right? That's a long axon, okay? So these are single long cytoplasmic processes, and they actually will propagate, right, which means to conduct the electrical signal down the axon away from the cell body. So we have a couple parts of the axon. The cytoplasm of the axon, we have a word for. This is known as the axoplasm. And that has cytoskeleton within it. So some of those neurofibrils are in there. Different organelles like mitochondria, the Nissl bodies will be in there, different enzymes, right? That's known as the axoplasm. The cell membrane of the axon is called the axolemma. So all in here, it's not labeled on this diagram, but inside here, this would be the axoplasm. And again, the cell membrane here, right, the outer edge, or it's labeled up over here, that would be the axolemma. Before we go back to the notes, let me show you real quick here. So the first part of the axon, which attaches to the cell body, is kind of like this cone-shaped area right here. This is known as the axon hillock, right? So that's the beginning part of the axon. Just distal to the axon hillock, right there, this is known as the initial segment. We're going to see in a subsequent lesson that this is the first place on the axon that generates the nerve impulse, and then the nerve impulse travels in this direction, right? You can even see the arrow here. All right, it's going to go down. All right, and I'll show you how that's done in a separate lesson. Okay, initial segment, I take it back, axon, hillock first, initial segment. And then one other thing, it's not labeled on here. Sometimes axons will have a branch so that we could send the action potential to some other part of the nervous system. So let's just say the electrical impulse will come down this way, right? It'll continue here, but it will also spread this way. This is known as an axon collateral. Okay, let's pick up here again. So the axon hillock, again, is that little cone-shaped area that attaches the axon to the cell body. And then just next to, right, distal to the axon hillock is the initial segment, which we looked at. The axon collateral is going to be the branching of an axon, bringing the action potential to another part of the nervous system. And then we'll finish up looking at the neuron by looking at this end down over here. Notice the axon doesn't end as a blunt end. It actually branches out. These branches are known as the telodendria. Additionally, at the end of the telodendria, there's a swelling. This is known as the axon terminal. Within here is where we have neurotransmitters, such as acetylcholine, that type of thing. Okay, so the telodendria are the fine extensions of the distal axon. This way the axon can come into contact with more than one structure. And then the axon terminals are the tips of the telodendria. They're the little bit of a swelling, and that's going to contain the neurotransmitter. Okay, that is the anatomy of a basic neuron. Now, Within the axon, there's actually the movement of materials between the cell body and the end of the axon. And this is known as axonal transport or axoplasmic transport. All right, so that materials in there, it's just not stationary, they're moving. The materials move along the neurotubules within the axon. And that's all powered by the mitochondria. They provide the ATP, and then these special proteins that actually move help physically move the materials down the axon, right? We have one known as kinesin and dynein. Okay, right? So it's a good picture. Gives us all the parts of the neuron. So the next thing we want to take a look at are how we classify neurons. There's two basic classifications. The first one I'm going to go over with you is the structural classification of neurons, where we are interested in what the neuron looks like. There's going to be four types of structural classifications. The second classification system we're going to look at is the functional system. And this is where we're not concerned what the neuron really looks like. We're more concerned with which way are the nerve impulses flowing. And that's known as the um, functional classification. So within the structural classification, we're going to look at four different types of neurons. The first one is known as an an. So an, that prefix an means without. Axonic, without an axon, right? So this is an axonic neuron. These are typically small, and then all the processes look similar, right? You really can't tell if there's an axon or not. The kind of everything looks like dendrites. These are especially abundant in the brain and then are organs of special sense. So if we take a look over here, this is going to be the anaxonic, right? We have a cell body, and then again, you can see all of the branches coming off. Everything looks like dendrites, right? There's no axon. It's without an axon. The second type of neuron that falls under the structural classification is known as a bipolar neuron. So we know the prefix bi means two. If we look here at a bipolar neuron, here's the cell body, and then we have an axon on this side coming off the cell body, and then a common dendrite over here with more than dendritic branches over here. And at the end of the axon down here are the axon terminals. So they call it bipolar because the cell body has one, two processes extending off of it. Bipolar neurons are found in the organs of special sense, right? So they're actually in the retina of our eye. They're up in the nasal cavity of our nose. They're in our taste buds. They're inside our ears. Okay, so these are small. They're rare only because they're in just the organs of special sense, right? And they have just one dendrite, one axon, right? One process and then another process. And as I said, the main thing you want to walk away with today is that they are found in the organs of special sense. Right? So again, cell body, common dendrite here, and an axon down over here. The third type of neuron that is found in the structural classification is known as a unipolar neuron. So uni, we know the prefix is one, right? Means one. Let's take a look. So here we have a cell body. Notice there's just one little process extending off of it right above my cursor there that leads to an axon. Look at this, axon. And at the end of the axon are the dendrites. And then at this end of the axon are the axon terminals. The telodendria and the axon terminals. So these types of neurons are typically afferent or sensory neurons. If we try to draw like an imaginary line here, like this, and said, hey, this is our skin, the dendrites would be in our skin. And if something poked us, let's say, or we touched something hot, the dendrites would fire, send the signal down the axon this way, and the axon terminals here, right, the telodendria and the axon terminals, they're going to be in the spinal cord, right? So these unipolar neurons are always, right, always sensory. Okay, so unipolar neurons have an axon and dendrites that are fused. The cell body is pushed off to one side, and as I said before, that cell body has one little process coming off of it. And as we mentioned just previously, the sensory neurons within the peripheral nervous system are going to be unipolar. And we'll look at that in a subsequent lesson. Okay, the last neuron that falls under the category of structural classification, this is what I've actually described to you already when we first started doing the anatomy of the neuron. These are multipolar neurons, right? We know that the prefix multi means more than two, at least, right? Many. So if you take a look here, cell body, and then all of these processes coming off in addition to an axon. So this is going to have multiple processes coming off the cell body, hence the name multipolar. All right, so these have one long axon and then at least two or more dendrites. These are very common in the central nervous system, and all of our motor neurons that are efferent, like leaving the spinal cord to go out to skeletal muscles, are going to be multipolar. Okay, so this is a good picture again showing the four different types of structural classifications. Again, anaxonic, bipolar, two processes, unipolar, one process, right? A process is an extension coming off the cell body, and then multipolar, right? Many processes coming off the cell body. Okay, so that's the structural classification. Let's take a look at the functional classification. So we kind of know the first two already because we did this when we did the layout of the nervous system in the previous lesson. So we're going to classify neurons functionally as sensory, motor, which I said we know already, and then the new one is going to be the interneurons. Let's review. So the sensory neurons are also known as afferent, right? That means they're generally going toward the central nervous system. If we were to look at these under the microscope, they would be unipolar. Now, the cell bodies of these neurons actually don't live in the brain or the spinal cord. They live just outside in a ganglia. A ganglia is a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So that's where we're going to find all of the cell bodies. The processes, the afferent fibers, extend from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. What am I saying by that? If we go to the unipolar neuron, right, these dendrites here would be out in the body, let's say in the skin, and now the axon is going to head towards the spinal cord, and then these telodendria and axon terminals would be in the spinal cord. Somatic sensory neurons, again, we know the word somatic means body wall. These are going to come from the body wall and send the impulses towards the brain and spinal cord. They are monitoring the external environment, what's going on around you. Visceral sensory neurons, they're in the organs, right? They're inside. They're monitoring the internal environment. Okay, so we have sensory neurons that are both somatic, and then other ones are visceral. They're either I should say they're not both. They are either somatic or visceral. Let's take a look at some of the types of sensory receptors that we find on these sensory neurons. So when we have receptors that are monitoring the inside systems, right, our internal systems, such as the digestive system, urinary system, respiratory system, these are known as interoreceptors, and they're sensitive to things like stretch, if an organ is stretching, if there's pressure, right, or if there's pain coming from that organ. When receptors are monitoring what's going on around us, these are known as exteroreceptors. They monitor the external environment, things like temperature. Okay. We also have some complex senses that involve exteroreceptors, such as sight, smell, and hearing. Right? But the main thing I want you to know is that the exteroreceptors are monitoring things on the outside of us. The last type of receptor is known as a proprioceptor. Um, just so you know, proprioception is position sense, right? Proprioception is really what tells the brain where you are in space. So proprioceptors, they monitor our position and also how much we're moving, okay? So that's the sensory neurons. The second classification under functional are the motor neurons. These we can also call the efferent. Again, think of E for exit. These carry information from the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, away to some type of effector. Okay, so these are going to carry information away. We have two types of motor neurons. The somatic motor neurons, they're going to innervate our skeletal muscles. And the visceral motor neurons, that's part of the autonomic nervous system, they're going to innervate smooth muscle organs that say organs that have smooth muscle, blood vessels that have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, which is the heart, glands, and even adipose tissue. Right? So if the motor neurons are going to the organs, we call them visceral motor neurons. Right? Somatic, again, going to the body wall. So these would go to your skeletal muscles to make them contract. Okay, so that should be a review, the sensory and the motor. That should be familiar from a previous lesson. Oh, just actually, let me add one thing. This is a little bit advanced. I was debating about taking it out, but I left it in. So when we have these visceral efferents, there's actually two fibers. Um, Signals from the central nervous system to the visceral effectors, like the organs, they're going to actually cross autonomic ganglia. And what that means is from the central nervous system, there's going to be a preganglionic fiber that's going to go into a ganglia. There's going to be a synapse, and now a postganglionic fiber is going to go out and go to the organs. Like I said, this is a little bit advanced. With the somatic motor neuron, it's just one motor neuron going from the spinal cord, let's say, out to a muscle. Here, it's going to be two neurons and they synapse in a ganglia. Right? A little bit advanced, but we'll throw it out there for now. The third classification of neurons are known as interneurons. These are neither sensory neurons nor are they motor, right? Most of the neurons in the brain and the spinal cord are interneurons. Their job is to just process information. These are the neurons that stay in our brain, that are in our brain and our spinal cord, that are just processing information as it comes into the brain and spinal cord, and then deciding if we need to send information out. Right? So these are responsible for the distribution of sensory information and also the coordination of motor activity. They're even involved in higher functions such as memory, planning. What you're trying to do right now, learning this neurology, right, is all involves interneurons. So again, they don't leave the brain or the spinal cord, right? They stay within the brain and spinal cord and are involved with processing information. By the way, not that you need to know it from me, but sometimes they call these interneurons association neurons. That may be another term that you may hear. Okay, this is the last slide for this lesson. So what they're showing you here, just to kind of put this together, in purple is the peripheral nervous system, which are the nerves, and then in yellow is the central nervous system, which would be the brain and spinal cord. So here they're showing you, some type of receptor, and the sensory neuron bringing information to the brain and spinal cord. Notice the sensory neuron is unipolar, right? So we look here, here's the cell body, one extension right here coming off the cell body, and then here's the common axon. Right down here would be the dendrites. Now the axon terminals here, the telodendria, go into the spinal cord. Within the spinal cord, or the brain, I should say, right, brain or spinal cord, we have the interneuron, right? So this is receiving information from the sensory neuron, and then it's going to relay it to the motor neuron, That cell body lives in the spinal cord, and then the axon goes out. And again, it could go to a muscle or a gland and cause the muscle to contract or a gland to release its product. Notice the interneuron and the efferent neuron, the motor neuron, are multipolar. What does that mean? Again, cell body with multiple processes coming off of it, multiple processes coming off of it. All right, so this is a nice picture taking, the functional classification, sensory neuron, bringing it into the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and then integrating neurons within the brain and spinal cord, and then sending out an outflow, right, back out to the peripheral nervous system. Okay, and that is our anatomy of the neuron.